If you can ensure that the team has what it needs to be successful, then the customer does get what it deserves and you do deliver on the promises. And so I really think about the team first, and I really do think about how to ensure that the team is engaged, how does the team understand what the mission and vision of the organization is, how do we stay true to our values, all the things that people give lip service to, but as soon as a customer knocks on the door, they ignore.
Which is more important, taking care of your employees and your culture, or taking care of your customers and your product development? It's an unfair question to be sure, because, well, it's all important. But on the other hand, we don't live in a world of limitless resources, most especially when it comes to time. So, who wins between investing in your employees or your customers? I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast, a production of the People Forward Network. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. You just heard from Jay Rudman, CEO of SciStream, a global leader in 3D measuring technology with clients spanning from apparel to uniforms to fitness. Previously in Jay's career, he's co-founded 3 businesses that all either successfully scaled and sold, went public, or became part of publicly traded organizations. In our conversation, Jay talks about a key relationship in his life that many senior leaders fail to invest in. We also touch on Jay's perspectives on the differences between leading as a founder and stepping into an already established organization to lead. And he should know because he's done both. Finally, we dig into Jay's unique definition and ideas on the concept of politics at work. But first, we begin with Jay sharing stories of the leaders who have influenced him the most, not only with their functional expertise, but also through shared experiences.
Senior leadership teams that I've worked with have all helped shape me because they all bring not only their functional expertise, but also different shared experiences. Good examples are heads of engineering teams, be it VP engineering, CTO, whatever else. I'm not a technician. I am a business leader. And so for them to be able to communicate the engineering elements and the technical elements and the impact on the business has helped me better understand tech. And so I can speak more eloquently to the team as communicating strategy, but also externally whenever I speak to clients. So I would say members of my senior leadership team throughout the various businesses that I've operated have been incredibly beneficial. The other external influence, which has only been the last few years, but has been instrumental, has been a coach. I've been working with an executive coach. She has provided a third-party perspective on opportunities for me to continue to improve. And I can often come to her with, this is the challenge I'm facing. And it's amazing how through an hour conversation, which we do twice a month, she can really pierce the veil and help me better appreciate how I can be a better leader. So I would say it's a combination of those two factors that have really helped me grow.
Now, let's talk about the coach thing a little bit, because there are a number of senior executives who engage with one-on-one coaching. And then there are others who maybe they thought about it once 5 years ago, but life is happening and they haven't paused long enough to think about it. What was it for you that pushed you over the edge and said, hey, I'm going to give this a shot. I'm going to make this investment of time, energy, and money?
Well, a little bit of jealousy and that others had coaches. And I was like, they're doing it, I should be doing it. The other thing was the realization that this sounds a little pithy, but let's just go with it, is, LeBron James has a coach. Greatest player in the world, and he still has a coach. And it's because we all need someone who's not on the court watching the game, instructing us. I will also say there are just challenges in business that you can't work your way through without really verbalizing it. And who are you going to verbalize that to? A spouse, a partner, a mentor? Some of those people are great, but they're very episodic. A coach is the common thread and understands who you are and where you've been and where you're headed, and not only understands your strengths, but also your weaknesses. I think it's really important to find the right coach. If you've tried it before and it didn't work, I recommend that you try to find someone different and find someone that matches your personality and style. My coach, for example, appreciates that I am intellectually curious. She's an academic who is also a coach and just recently completed her PhD. So she appreciates that we verbalize and discuss and bounce around ideas, but then she follows up with additional readings, support materials, and will continually bombard me with other resources and guides for me to review. And because she knows that's my style, and I would think that working with a coach that doesn't do that, I would probably find suboptimal.
I'm never short on sports analogies, so great that we go there, and we can have the MJ LeBron fight here in a little while. But the idea of somebody who's off to the sideline looking, literally the analogy is from a different perspective. They're on the sideline, they're not in the game, and that gives them the freedom to see things that you don't see. Now, do you see things within the organization that she doesn't see? Of course you do. It's a combination, and so many of the great ones, we've seen that over time in all kinds of different sporting endeavors. It's more of a partnership than anything else. It's a back and forth. Here's what I'm seeing. What are you seeing? Okay, that's what you're seeing. Here's what I'm seeing. And so I think while it's so easy to see that analogy in the athletic world, I think it applies just as well here in the business world. And I think that's a wonderful way to think about it. If somebody could watch the movie of what's going on and offer a different perspective, even if you don't agree with it fully, to be able to know that's more information. If I hear one more leader tell me they don't have enough information, like this is the number one thing that I hear over and over, or at least in the top 2 or 3. And so here's another source. If you trust this person, you think they know what they're talking about, I should say, then to get that perspective, where would be the downside of that? So I love that analogy from you.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said, Tim. There's all sorts of different ways to think about it. Coaching with a sports metaphor is one way. The movie analogy you spoke of is another. My coach often tells me, she gives me quips to remember because you need a mantra. And her mantra to me is get out of the river, which is basically sometimes you jump in the river and the water is so fast and it's pushing you and you're pushing back on the river. And we know you can't stop a rushing river. No one individual can jump into a river and try to stop that water. And that's kind of how business operates sometimes. It's moving fast. You jump into the trenches, you think that you're going to solve a problem, and what you're really trying to do is stop a rushing river, and it doesn't make any sense. And then only then do you have the perspective as to how to guide and lead the organization correctly.
Wow, that's a good word right there, really good. And I cannot resist the pun if we're going to talk about rivers and you're leading size stream. I'm just going to say it out loud there for a second. So anyway, you have had a number of different executive leadership roles over the course of your career. And as we got a chance to visit offline previously, we started to talk about something called inside out leadership. And I wonder if you might share a little bit more about your perspective on what that is and why you think it's important.
Absolutely. So this has been part of my leadership journey that I've gone through, both externally as well as just internal retrospective. We are taught in every kind of business class, be it undergraduate, MBA, anything that you watch on TED, wherever it might be, is customers are always right. And I agree to that to some level. And that's how I ran my businesses initially, is customers always right. Let's do everything. Let's iterate as quickly as possible, make sure the customer gets what the customer deserves. But at the same time, who the heck is doing all that work? That is your team. That is your employees. That is the folks that you are relying on every single day in those trenches to deliver what the customer needs. And so to put the customer first is important, but I think that's ignoring the people that actually do the work, and that is your team. And therefore, I've crafted this new mentality over the last X number of years as I've matured and experienced a lot of highs and lows in business. That is really about inside out management, is really thinking not about the customer first, but about your own team first. Because if you can ensure your team has what it needs to be successful, be it the skills, be it the resources, the time, the money, whatever it might be, and I know that's really hard, but if you can ensure that the team has what it needs to be successful, then the customer does get what it deserves and you do deliver on the promises. And so I really think about the team first, and I really do think about how to ensure that the team is engaged, how do the team understand what the mission and vision of the organization is, how do we stay true to our values, all the things that people give lip service to, but as soon as a customer knocks on the door, they ignore. I really try not to ignore that and ensure that my team is well cared for.
So what would you say to somebody who would roughly agree that take care of your team and then they will take care of your customers perspective, but has this concern. I think you see it in organizations often where they totally lose the voice of the customer. They become insular in a way. Do you have to guard against the organization looking too inward, or is that not a concern as you focus on the team?
I'm not saying the entire organization should be focused inward. That's my responsibility as the CEO of the organization to ensure that I have the right butts and seats, I have the right capabilities, I have the right resources, I have the right budget, etc. The folks that are on the front line, that the operators, the ones that are shaking the hands of the customers, they have to deliver. And so they do have to think about the customer, but my job is to ensure that I have the right people on those front lines.
That makes sense, and it's a good clarification there. I mentioned earlier, you've been in senior leadership positions a number of different times in your career. As you think back to some of your earlier executive leadership experiences to where you are now, what would you say are some of the biggest shifts or changes that you've had in how you lead and how you think about leadership over the course of those variety of experiences?
Yeah, I would say early in my career, I thought I had to be a doer as much as a thinker. I've quickly learned over many mistakes that trying to be a doer as well as a thinker is really hard when you're running an organization. And therefore, instead, what I've done in my later businesses is really surround myself by really good doers. Certainly still enable them to think. I am certainly not suggesting I'm looking for robots. But at the same time, there is a necessity for you to put people in situations that they're really good at as individual contributors who can bring their skills and experiences to fruition and can deliver, and leave the strategy and leave the long-term planning and leave the 5-year roadmap and all that other stuff to other parts of the organization. And so for me to separate that and basically hire doers and allow the senior leadership team to think about the roadmap has really been very empowering.
Are there any specific examples, just to put it in a kind of tangible example of here's something that I did as a doer many years ago, but I don't do that now. I leave that to others.
Product roadmap, by far. Every founder of an organization thinks that they should drive the product roadmap. And there are tons of books and articles in the popular press that says the founder should drive the product roadmap. I have found that early incarnation of product roadmap is a very down, dirty, deep, and disgusting process. And it makes a lot of sense for the founder to be involved at that point in time. But as soon as it starts to iterate past beta or POC or even V1, you really need experts to start to drive that product roadmap. Certainly you can be the subject matter expert. Certainly you can help influence, but you really need product managers to run the product roadmap because they're great at interpreting what the founder like myself or a CEO has and bringing it to the rest of the organization, encompassing all the competitive analysis, encompassing all the capabilities of the organization, and interpreting that for the engineering in terms of user stories, et cetera. And anytime I have jumped back into product roadmap, I have failed. It just causes so much dissonance in the organization. It's really hard. You can certainly influence, you can certainly create your vision, you can certainly try to say this is the long-term North Star we're aiming for, but at the same time, the details associated with the product roadmap, you just muck up things when you try to get in there.
One of the things as we were preparing to have the session here today that we talked about previously was something connected to shared values and shared behaviors. Can you expand on that? Because those are the kind of terms that we would all throw around in the executive suite and say very nonchalantly, maybe expectantly, that just happens, and it becomes a cliche that maybe gets applied or maybe doesn't, but it just sounds nice. But you have a little more commitment to it than it's sounding nice. So I'd love for people to hear a little bit more about that from you.
One of my businesses was in the direct selling world. And just to explain to the listeners who don't know direct selling, it's most analogous to, and these might be legacy names, but I think they're pretty commonly understood, are the Tupperwares, Avon, Pampered Chefs of the world. So you have distributed volunteer workforce. In my case, I had 600 different reps who were spread across 48 different states in the United States who were selling the wares that we were offering out of home office. Imagine this. You have 600 people out there, volunteer sales force. What's the only way to keep them connected to the organization? It's really hard. You can try it through extrinsic motivators like compensation or professional development and a career and title and things like that. It doesn't work. And I made those mistakes. The only thing that keeps people tethered to the organization and really drives them forward are the intrinsics. And those intrinsics are the values of the organization, the mission that you believe that you're trying to drive towards. And if you don't clearly articulate what those values are, if you don't clearly articulate the mission and vision that you're driving towards, you'll get organizational drift. You have 600 people all heading in different directions. And so that's when all of a sudden I had this awakening of, I need to do a better job with this. And ever since that business, which was a few businesses ago at this point in time, I've really tried to cement this and improve upon it further. In the current business I'm in right now, SideStream, which you had mentioned, I walked into a 10-year-old business. A 10-year-old business that's had a very successful but windy path and was looking for a little bit of a cold restart. It had some amazing technology, but needed to hone its strategy and rethink who its target audience was. And although it's really tempting to jump into an organization and quickly try to solve problems, the first thing I did was to get the organization to articulate what its inherent values were. Because again, there's 10 years worth of foundation here to build upon. There are values, they just probably had never been surfaced. And so we spent an extended period of time working through what those values were. We did that through a committee of various members of various departments. And over a period of about 90 plus days, we came up with the 6 values. Why is that important? Well, we know how competitive this workplace is, this workforce is, this work environment is, and people can disengage with the business. And so by having values, people are now saying, this is a place I want to work. There might be people who say, this is a place I don't want to work, and that's perfectly fine. We don't want to force anyone into a value system they don't believe in. But now people are engaged. We haven't lost anyone in our organization because of a misfit. And I think that's really important, not only stepping into a new organization, but even in an existing organization, is to clearly articulate what those values are so there's a better engagement of the employees.
The sister connections there of values regarding language and behaviors. Ultimately, you can do the work that you've done, but then there are these things that come along working all together to shape the culture that you want to have. Talk a little bit, if you would, about the importance of language, because that is the embodiment, essentially. How do you see that, and how do you see your role as a senior executive in leaning into not only the clarification of values, as you described, but also how do we ensure that language and behavior is consistent and aligns with that?
Great question. And when you think about what culture is, right? And I'm talking about in geopolitical world, is basically that we all speak the same language. We all have a shared common understanding of what's important, henceforth called values. We all behave similarly. And when you do that, you actually have a culture that hums along. It's hard to believe that can occur across hundreds of millions of people, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. But it certainly can work in an organization that's 20 people or 2,000 people. So values is important, but you're right. The language and the behaviors are the next element associated with building a strong culture. And by language, one of the things that I've done in organizations, and certainly people can do this in any number of ways, is I bring in an operating system. There are many who follow EOS, which is Entrepreneurial Operating System, which was a book out there called Traction by Gino Wickman. There's tons of other operating systems. I'm not to suggest you should follow one over any other. I use a bastardized version of EOS. It's bastardized by myself. I've just found that certain things work better for me. But that language is absolutely important. And some language that, organizations bring in are KPIs and goals and strategic plans and rocks and whatever else. But whatever that language is, it's incredibly empowering for the organization to latch onto and all start to speak it. So one of the things we've done at SideStream is we built a 3-year BHAG, which is a big, hairy, audacious goal, a 1-year operating plan, and a 90-day rock and accountabilities associated with achieving those rocks. So that's my bastardized version of an operating system, but that language is now permeated. And I was immediately prior to this podcast in a leadership meeting where I would say probably every fifth word out of someone's mouth was, is this a rock? Does this align to a rock? How does this get us closer to our operating plan? Is this one of the key results that we're aiming for? Like, it was just wonderful to watch and listen because people get it. The second part to your question is around behaviors. And behaviors, I believe, waterfall through an organization. You are always in a bubble when you're a leader. People are always watching what you're doing. And even from the very first day you're born as a child, you're modeling off your parents, and then you're modeling off your siblings, and then you're modeling off of your peer group and your friends. Well, in organizations, they all model off the CEO, the other C-suite members, the other senior leaders, etc. So you have to appreciate you're in that bubble, and you have to behave it correctly because everyone else is going to follow what you do. And if you're doing well, then that will eventually permeate and waterfall through the organization, and everyone else will do well. If you don't do well, and what I mean by that is you're 5 minutes late to a meeting, you don't have set agendas, during your all hands, you stumble, you don't communicate well, you're meandering, your PowerPoints aren't clean, you have grammatical errors everywhere. Like, you're just setting standards. And those standards are understood that, well, if it's okay by Jay, then it's okay by me, and therefore everything just deteriorates thereafter.
Yeah. I noticed a number of years ago, not all that long ago, that in Home Depot, in the tools area, that all of a sudden one day there were cameras on all four corners. And the thing that Home Depot didn't want to catch the people stealing without them knowing it. They wanted to avoid the stealing altogether. So in addition to having the cameras there, they had monitors that were facing you, the customer, where you could see you. And in addition to that, there was a motion sensor. And if you stood still long enough and then started to move, a bright white light would come on and a ding would happen to let you know the camera is recording. And as I walked through that section, it reminded me of exactly what you're just describing. As leaders, we can complain until the cows come home about always being watched. You know what that's not going to change? Us always being watched. It is the reality, and actions speak louder than words. So you can say all day long that excellence is part of our culture here, and we're going to pursue it. But when I'm not excellent in the very tangible ways that you just described, when I show up for the group PowerPoint and it's clear that I haven't prepared, or that I've got a bunch of misspellings in what I'm sharing with the organization, I'm communicating with my actions where the excellence line is, and perhaps it's a lot lower. So that as a leader, I'm always in the tool section at Home Depot, always, because those cameras are on, and we have the advantage in Home Depot of the visual and auditory reminders. Unfortunately, it's not quite as clear to us as leaders. If we can hopefully keep that in mind and understand that we're always setting those standards. We're not going to be perfect, but are we striving to live out those behaviors that we expect from the organization? So I just really appreciate how tangible that is from you.
Absolutely. And you can mimic that Home Depot analogy you just put forth, which is I do video record meetings. You record it so anyone that's unable to attend can watch it. I'm the harshest critic of myself of like, why am I rambling here? Or why am I wandering the room when I should be anchored to the front? Why am I looking at the slides rather than speaking to the point? I am totally criticizing myself frequently. I think Ray Dalio does this. I can't remember if it's in Principles or elsewhere, where he has the software that is distributed to all the leaders. And throughout the meeting, they're providing real-time feedback through the software as to whoever has the floor at that particular moment is performing. I think that'd be wonderful. I try to mimic it in some sense, and that's at the end of every one of my senior leadership meeting, I send out a feedback form. How did we do? How did I do? What can we do better? It takes 2 minutes, 3 minutes. There's some quantitative, there's some qualitative, there's some high points and some low points, and I can definitely plot when there's low points as to why that might have been. And it's never, well, it's because of him or her. It's always about me. I look in the mirror and say, what could I have done better to improve?
Well, I so appreciate that perspective in terms of where does the buck stop ultimately, regardless of whether you're the one that's presenting or not. If somebody else is presenting, but I'm leading the organization, it's ultimately my responsibility to make sure that they're ready to go. And they have to be responsible adults. I'm not talking about babysitting, but how and where all of that lands squarely with us, I think, is a really important perspective, and really appreciate that. As you've led, there's this distinction. You talked about coming to SciStream after 10 years, but then there's also the founding leader. What do you see as differences that are important to keep in mind? Because I'm sure we've got some founding leaders that are listening, but then we've got other people who are stepping into senior leadership roles, whether they be in publicly traded or privately held companies. What are some of the key differences that you think are important to keep in mind between founding leaders and leaders that are stepping into organizations that have been well established?
So just to set some history, so my first three businesses, I was either a founding member or a co-founding member, all of which we successfully scaled and sold, either went public or became a part of public organizations. From then, I took a little bit of reprieve and did some coaching and mentoring and advising and investing, et cetera, and then was brought back into my last two organizations where I was a hired CEO. I will say that transition was tough. I made a bunch of mistakes along the way. And the thing that you have to quickly do as a hired CEO or a hired member of an executive team is understand the politics of the organization. And politics has a negative connotation, and I don't wish it to be determined or deemed that way. You have to understand how business operates. One of my advisors once said, "Who's driving the bus?" You have to understand who's driving the bus. Is it sales and marketing? Is it engineering? Is it something else? You really have to understand how decisions are made, because then and only then can you, as the new kid on the block, come in and try to make change. And oftentimes that change occurs through a change management process and not through brute force. Brute force, I've tried, it doesn't work. You really have to understand the nuance and the politics associated with it. And so at SciStream, for example, as I already alluded to, the first 90 days was really just a listening tour, speaking to employees, speaking to partners, speaking to the owner of the business, speaking to clients, speaking to competitors, understanding really the entirety of what we're doing well and what we need to improve upon. And then basically understanding what the strategic intent of the organization should be, but not then pitching it to the business right away. It was then the politicking. It was ensuring that I had a coalition of important individuals within the organization who were well aligned with what I was attempting to do. So it's building that coalition through a very grassroots operation. And it sounds painful, and it sounds like brute force would be so much faster. And it sounds like, why would anyone want to do this? This is an organization. You're the CEO. Just get it done. No, I've just learned that you really need to methodically and pragmatically move through this political process to build the coalition, to get influencers to appreciate what you're trying to do. And then and only then can you really expand it to the rest of the organization for it to gain traction.
I would imagine that there are some moments where brute force authoritarianism is necessary. And I think what you're painting there is that it's not very often, because if you go with that approach, there's going to be carnage and there's going to be a long cleanup process afterwards. It's going to be very painful. And if you have a radically terrible strategy or moral issue, then maybe at times you have to begin with that. That's not the norm. And I would even say, I can't count the number of times in my career when I would say, people want to say the best idea wins. It doesn't win because of exactly what you are talking about. If I have nobody else on board, we haven't won hearts and minds, I haven't listened. I love that you begin with that. People will tell you where the roadblocks are. When somebody tells me, here's why it won't work, and this is taking off of some of the work from Dan Sullivan. He has something called the strategy circle, but basically seeing all those objections as the roadmap to success. If people tell me why it won't work, then they've just told me a problem that needs to be solved in order for it to work. And I don't get to hear any of that if I go authoritarian. I don't get to hear any of that if I go brute force, which is to say, if we're going to do anything in an organization, we can't be all by ourselves. You need people to execute on what the collective strategy is. So I love embracing politics in a more positive way there, which has to do with influencing, listening. In that regard, Jay, I think if you put in listening, you're really bringing we into it, even as you're sharing new ideas. So call it politics, call it relationship building while you're learning. So many positive things you're expressing there about how to move forward. I just appreciate your perspective on that.
My pleasure. I do think that, if I may pick up on the situations for which authoritarianism does step in, where there needs to be directive, where there needs to be someone who's running point and pushing hard and moving forward. There are times for that, so I completely agree with you. We had one at SideStream. We experienced a quality issue. And I've experienced that in the past in different organizations. And sometimes I've let quality issues lay fallow and it's bitten me. And I decided that, based upon historical experience, that I wasn't going to let it bite me here at SideStream. So we had a quality issue. We had to address it instantly. Now, there were two things that I did. And again, I've just learned this, and hopefully this is advantageous by your listeners, that I did that actually worked really well during this period where I had to step in. One is I clearly articulated the why. Why is this different than every other way we've done things? And two is I organized a strike team, a tiger team. You can call it whatever you want, whereby you bring together a cross-functional, cross-disciplinary approach. You gather the team, you explain the constraints, you explain the timeline, you explain the resources, you explain the why, you explain what the definition of success is, and then you let them get their work done in a very expedited fashion. Of course, you continue to mold and check in and guide, but then once it's done, you then disband and get back to business as usual. I have found that to work really successful, and I will continue to deploy that at SideStream or other future endeavors. But clearly articulating that why is really step one, and you can't ignore it.
That is profoundly important. I've seen that oftentimes when leaders take the time to clearly articulate why, that even people who have disagreements will oftentimes be able to move forward. They've been heard, their opinion isn't agreed with, but they are given a solid rationale, whether they agree with it or not, to see things moving forward. And oftentimes, as mature adults can say, okay, well, it wasn't my call. Here's where we're going. At least I understand why, versus do it with no why. As we begin to wrap up, as a person who has led many different organizations, and again here, both from the founder and then hired into senior executive leadership roles, as you look forward in your career personally, what are the type of marks that you're hoping to leave as a leader? You look at your life, you're not near retirement unless you want to be, and yet looking out on the horizon, I've got a decade or two, however you do that equation, say, gosh, when I decide to really slow it down, here's what I want to have done. Here's who I want to have been. What kind of thoughts do you have as you look forward to the marks that you're wanting to make as a leader with the organizations that you're working with?
I had this conversation with my coach frequently, and one of the questions that she poses to me that really helps illustrate where I wish to go throughout my career and wherever I might lead is, tell me when you feel that hum, when you feel like you're in the vibe. And it's a really easy answer for me. I say a really good day is when I have a senior leadership discussion and we basically have tackled a really hard problem. And I will say we might not have perfect alignment initially, but by the end of the conversation, we do. And we walk out of that room with a strong communication plan about how we're going to pursue it and how we're going to message it to the rest of the organization. That is a really good day for me. And so now I take that and I abstract it out to what my future holds. I really enjoy working with senior leaders, be it internal in my organization or maybe peers in advisory boards or in forums or wherever else it might be, talking about really hard problems, coming up with great solutions, and then basically walking away feeling like we've had an understanding and an alignment. I really enjoy doing that, and I have to go seek either professional opportunities like I do with SideStream now, or in other opportunities such as potentially advising, investing, coaching, mentoring, board membership, even in the academic world as an instructor or professor, whereby I can try to mimic those really good days I have in the company.
I love the very practical nature of so much of what Jay was sharing with us. So many applicable things from a leadership position. But before we complete this episode and wrap it up, there are a couple of things that I want to draw your attention to. The first one was the section where Jay and I had a chance to talk about the behaviors. What are the behaviors that back up the values in the organization? And specifically that idea that we as leaders are always on display. He talked about this idea of when I'm in front of the organization, am I prepared? Am I holding the quality level, the excellence level for what I want others to perform under? Or do I think I'm busy, or I'm a senior leader, they'll understand, or I just don't have time for that? Or maybe you're not good at that and you're not setting aside the time that needs to get other people involved in the way you're presenting to the organization, so those missteps and typos can be caught. It sounds like a really tiny thing. Here we are on a senior executive podcast talking about leadership, and I'm talking about typos. I thought we were going to talk about really heady, important stuff like strategy and the deep dive into who we are as leaders. And the truth of the matter is, yes, I love strategy and I love the deep dive into the who of leadership. But when we see ourselves either above the organization or don't see the influence that we have and understand that the way that we do things is going to, day in and day out, influence the quality level within the organization, then we're missing something important. And so we'll take a moment here to talk about something as simple as typos in a presentation. And again, we said during the interview, this isn't about being perfect, because you're going to make some mistakes along the way, be they big or small, but it is about an attitude. And do I see each and every communication and interaction that I have with the people that I'm leading, with the organization as a whole, do I see each of those as a standard setting opportunity? Do I see each of those as a moment where I get to help not only communicate the message that I'm sharing, but also the type of organization that we want to be? And there's so many different ways to execute that. But number one at the top of the list, am I being intentional about my behavior with the organization so I can set that standard, so I can set that example? The other thing I want to take a moment to talk about is this idea of feedback and listening. And you heard it from Jay in a couple of different ways. He talked about a few different times this idea of a listening tour, especially when you're new to a leadership role, is listening to others, to understand their perspective, to not assume that just because I have a lot of experience that I have it all figured out. Because I'll tell you what you don't have figured out perfectly, even if you have tons of experience, is what is the unique perspective of each person? Where are they from a momentum standpoint, from an emotional standpoint? Maybe you do see around the corner and you know where the department or the organization needs to go, and people are just confirming that, but you get a chance to learn it in their own words. And by the way, if you do things like a listening tour in a very sincere way and get a chance to empathize with the people you're leading, you're setting the stage for greater followership over time. So the listening tour provides a lot of information, but it's also delivering a message if we do it with a great heart of humility and learning. And then along those same lines, you heard Jay talk about feedback after they have all hands meetings, those town hall meetings, those company-wide meetings. To get feedback, to understand, did we do well? Did we communicate clearly? Do you understand where we're heading? How do you feel about what's coming next? To have those feedback follow-ups, to not just assume, but to really listen to the organization. It's a different form than a listening tour, but it's in the same vein, which is to say, we need to hear from our people. We need to understand how they're experiencing what we're doing. We can't just assume that it's gone the way that we wanted to. We've got to check in. So that leads me to the question I want to leave you with today, and that is this. What are your regular, intentional methods for hearing from and receiving feedback from the people you are leading? I'm Tim Spiker, reminding you to be worth following and to follow us wherever you receive your podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, please share our podcast with your friends and colleagues. And if you're up for it, leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.